Hi, in this video we are going to see how we can export a database of the Windows Azure Cloud. Now the database that's available to us is a SQL Azure database that's available in every account by default. And in this case what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and export my WordPress blog database, which is hosted on the SQL Azure platform. Now, the first thing that we need to do when we're going to go ahead and export our database is obviously connect to the Windows Azure Management Studio or Windows Azure Management Portal. And in this portal, what we have is we've got a list of all these different features or functionality available as part of the Windows Azure Cloud. When we're storing data in the cloud, we've got a couple of different ways that we can do it. One of them is the SQL database, which is the default relational database platform available. And then we've got storage, which is essentially just a way that you can go ahead and dump files, tables, and queues. And this is obviously something else that we need to discuss maybe later on. But today what we're going to do is we're going to export a database from the relational database as a backpack file and store it on a blob storage account that we have here. The intention being that this account will basically act like a file system or a thumb drive or some additional external storage into which I can copy paste or move files around. This is how basically we attach additional drives to a virtual machine also. So when you're working with Windows Azure, typically you'll have a website, and the website would have a database, and this website would be related to this database via some mappings. Now, occasionally it becomes important for us to store the data in the database and then export that data later on, primarily to maybe set up a development environment or as a redundant backup against what probably available on the cloud as well. Now, the good thing about SQL Azure or Windows Azure on the cloud is basically that even when you don't specify it, SQL backups are being taken for you by default. And what that means is basically that any database that you create here is already being backed up. So you can see here that we've got the database, and then we've got the server. If you click the database, you can see that we've got certain features that's already enabled by default in terms of being able to take backups. And if you're using the most basic version, then the minimum retention period is close to 7 days. And what that means is that you probably have double the amount of hard disk space available to take the backup. So if your database is maybe 30 gigabytes, you'll probably have about 60 gigabytes of storage available for backups. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and have that, but we would also like a copy of our database on maybe our laptops or desktops so that we can set up a development environment to maybe test or add some new functionality. Now, the best way to do that is to use the export functionality. So just to show you how to get there, what we do is once we logged into SQL Server or once we logged into the Windows Azure Cloud, you'll see that we've got something called SQL databases on the left hand side, and inside the databases you'll have a list or different rows for each database that you have hosted under this particular server. Now in my case I've got one server and one database, so you can see that the database name is WordPress 986 and it's hosted on my server W something over here, and this is the one that I want to export. So the first thing I do is I'll go ahead click this, and then if you see further down you'll have a button called export. Now the export button, what it does is that it extracts the data and the schema of the database hosted here on the cloud and creates script files into a backpack file. And this backpack file is then available for import at a later point in time. So I'll probably show a demonstration of that in another video, but today what we want to do is we want to go ahead, select the database that we want to export or backup, and then click the export button. When we do this, we get a pop-up, and you can see in the pop-up the very first thing that you see on top says that there are significant characteristics in terms of performance degradation when you use the export operation. Now what this means is that when you try to export, you might notice performance of the export operation itself is fairly slow, even for small databases. And this could be a challenge because you don't want to spend too much time trying to do an export, especially when you have very large databases. And one of the suggestions as far as doing this is concerned is when you have a very large database export that you need to do, it makes sense to upgrade the database instance to a higher version, finish the export, and then revert back to the lower version, just so that your export operation completes in time. Now, as part of this pop-up, you can see that we've got a couple of things that we need to set up here. The first one is obviously the file name. So by default, you can see it's database name followed by timestamp, and the file extension is going to be .bacpac backpack. Now, this particular file needs to be saved somewhere, and since this is the cloud, we don't have the ability to map network drives or our local drives directly to these machines on the cloud. So the way that we export data from the cloud is by using something called a blob storage account. Now, the blob storage account behaves something similar to an external hard disk that you can attach to your virtual machine or web service or any basic storage requirement that you have. You can provision additional storage as a blob storage account. And in our case, we're going to provision one just so that we can move our data and our backups to and from the cloud. So in the drop down list, if you go ahead, you'll see that I've got a couple of them already provisioned, but I'm going to create a new one. So it's going to be create a new storage account. And then I need to be able to connect to my SQL database to just let Azure know that I have the permissions to access this database, and therefore I should be able to export it as well. So I typed in the username and the password. Naturally, you need to make sure that the permissions are available, so I'm using an administrator account in this case. And the next thing I need to do is I need to go ahead and provision my storage account. Now, if you already have a storage account, then you wouldn't probably see this option here. You just go ahead and select the storage account that you want to dump the data into. But in this case, I'm trying to combine a few different aspects of Windows Azure in one video, so I'm going to create a storage account as well. And the idea behind the storage account is that if you see there, the first text box is a URL. Now, the URL is basically just a path that you can use to access your storage account. When you compare it to maybe space on a laptop or desktop, the URL would be the equivalent of maybe the C drive or D drive, basically the fixed drives that you have on the laptop itself. So I'm just going to call this external storage, and then you have the container name. Now, the container name is basically the equivalent of maybe a folder inside your C or D drive. So it allows you to logically classify or group data inside the storage that we are provisioning here. So I'm just going to call it blog data dumps. And you'll notice that we've also got something called location and affinity groups. Now, because of the performance implications, it makes sense to go ahead and choose a location that's closer to where your SQL database is hosted. So I'm just going to go ahead and use Southeast Asia, and after that I'm going to go and press complete. So at this point, you'll see that it's exporting the WordPress database, and more importantly, if you go under storage, you'll see that it's going to provision an additional blob storage account. So you can see here it says ext external storage, and it's creating that blob storage account for me right now. Now, this is pretty much it really. At this point, the database is being exported into this blob storage. Once it's completed, I'll show you how to go ahead and download that data off the blob storage onto your local hard disk. Now, when you have a large number of files, it probably makes sense for you to download a utility or a tool. And one of the most common ones that I use is the Azure Storage Explorer. You can download it off this link. All you need to do is go to Google and type in Azure Storage Explorer, and you should probably come to this link. And you can download it from here. The Azure Storage Explorer, what it does is that once you type in the required credentials, it can automatically connect to the cloud and expose all your containers and the files within those containers, very similar to how you would browse your C drive or D drive. So it allows you to go ahead and do a lot of the file system activities directly rather than have to work with it individually on the browser level. And this becomes important when you have to do exports quite frequently, or when you want to do imports. So it's definitely a good thing to have. But in case you're not having the provision, or you don't have the required permissions to do that, then you can always go ahead and download the database directly off the Internet Explorer or the browser. So I'm just waiting here for this to complete. So if you see here, it says export database WordPress 9.86 complete, so that's good. And if I go ahead and open up the storage account, you can see that I've got my containers here, and then I've got import and export. So if I click containers here, you should be able to see the container that I've just created, which is the blog data dumps. And inside this container, I should have the file that I just created, which is a backpack file of my database export. When I select it and press download, it'll essentially start the download of my database backpack. So you can see I've got my database backpack here. And that's pretty much it really. And with this, what we've done is we've gone ahead and exported the database backup directly off the Windows Azure Cloud onto our local systems. And that's all there is to it. So thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next video where I'll actually import and create a new database of this backup file.